The evening had been calm, the kind that carries no warning. I was sitting at my desk, hands lifted mid-gesture, when my granddaughter leaned closer to the screen and asked a question no child should ever have to form. It stopped my breath. It froze my hands in the air like they no longer belonged to me. Seconds later, the screen went black. No goodbye, no signal error, just gone. I kept calling. Again and again, watching the counter climb until numbers lost meaning. I felt something tightening in my chest. Not panic yet. Something colder, heavier. Instinct. The kind you earn only after a lifetime of learning when the world is lying to you. By the time I grabbed my keys and started driving south, I already knew I wasn't racing time. I was chasing aftermath. If you've ever carried a moment like that, one question, one silence, one instinct you couldn't ignore, I ask you to stay with me. Subscribe, not because this is a story, but because listening matters. And if you've lived something similar, share it below. Some truths only survive when they're witnessed. The call had felt routine, almost boring in its predictability. Same hour, same prop tablet on my desk, same practice cheer I had learned to perform so she wouldn't sense how much distance hurt me. She was spending the weekend at her grandmother's gated home outside Jacksonville, a place that had always been described to me with rehearsed reassurance. Secure, quiet, respectable, the kind of place people mention when they want to end a conversation, not invite questions. She held the tablet too close to her face at first, all forehead and eyes, then pulled it back and showed me a crooked paper heart she had cut out at school. The edges were uneven, one side thicker than the other. I told her it was perfect anyway because it was. She smiled in that quick, reflexive way children do when they're praised but already thinking about the next thing. She talked about a pool party planned for Sunday, about how she was allowed to stay up late because it was the weekend, about a movie she wanted to watch that her grandmother said might be a little grown up but probably fine. I remember noting that phrasing, how it felt borrowed. Adult words placed gently into a child's mouth. Nothing about the call felt urgent. That was the danger of it. Real emergencies rarely announce themselves with alarms. They hide inside ordinary moments and wait until you relax. Her eyes shifted off-screen a few times. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. She lowered her voice without quite meaning to, the way children do when they sense privacy before they understand danger. Her shoulders came up, tightening. She asked me if I could hear her clearly. I said yes. Then she asked her question. She didn't cry. She didn't sound frightened in the way adults expect fear to sound. She asked it carefully, like someone checking a rule, like she was worried she might be wrong. She asked whether it was normal for adults to take pictures of children without clothes. The words landed one by one, each heavier than the last. My hands stopped moving. I felt the blood leave my face, felt my pulse slow instead of quicken. A strange, terrible calm settled over me, the kind that comes when the mind is already bracing for impact. I leaned closer to the screen. I asked her where she had heard that, who had said something like that. I tried to keep my voice steady, aware that any sharpness might make her retreat. She started to answer, then the tablet tilted sharply, the image blurring into ceiling light and motion. For half a second I saw something dark move past the frame. Then the screen went black. The call ended. At first I assumed it was technical. A dropped connection. A battery issue. I called back immediately. It rang until it didn't. I called again. Straight to nothing. No voicemail. No error message. Just absence. I checked the time. I checked my signal. I checked the app, refreshed it twice like that might change reality. I sent a message asking if she was okay. Another saying to call me back when she could. I watched the screen for the small confirmation that never appeared. Minutes passed. Then more. The calm began to fracture. I called her grandmother's number. It rang longer than usual before cutting off. No answer. I tried again. Same result. I called the house phone listed in an old contact file I kept for emergencies. Disconnected. I told myself not to panic. I told myself that children ask strange questions sometimes, that adults misinterpret, that technology fails at the worst moments. But the image of her lowering her voice replayed in my head, sharper each time. Children don't lower their voices unless they think they're not supposed to be heard. I tried my daughter next. Straight to voicemail. Hospital shift. I knew the routine. Phones off. Focus demanded. Normally, I respected that boundary. That night, it felt like a wall closing in. I left messages anyway. One calm, one less so. I didn't mention the question at first. I just said the call had dropped, that I couldn't reach anyone, that something felt wrong. By the third message, I stopped editing myself. I said her name. I said I was scared. What made it worse was the way the silence felt intentional. Not empty, not accidental, like a door closed gently instead of slammed. I sat there staring at my dark screen, replaying the last seconds over and over. The tilt, the blur, the absence of any sound after. I wondered who had been in the room with her. I wondered who had been listening. I wondered whether she had known the call would end the moment she asked. The humiliation came later, layered over the fear. When I finally reached someone connected to the household, a security office number listed at the gate, I was treated like an inconvenience. Told visits were private. Told family matters were being handled. Told to wait until morning. Wait, as if time was neutral. As if waiting didn't always benefit the wrong people. I hung up without agreeing. My hands were shaking now, but my thinking had sharpened. I wrote down times, numbers, the exact wording of her question as best as I could remember it, afraid even memory might betray me later. I understood, dimly but clearly, that whatever had just happened would not resolve itself quietly. The call hadn't ended because of a technical problem. It had ended because she had said something she wasn't supposed to say. And somewhere deep beneath the fear, beneath the dread that was beginning to set its hooks into me, another certainty formed. The kind that changes how you move through the world. I was no longer a distant relative on a screen. I was now part of this whether anyone wanted me to be or not. By the time I reached my phone again, the clock had moved in a way that felt dishonest. Too much time had passed for nothing to have happened, and not enough time for anyone to claim resolution. That narrow window is where procedure thrives, where rules are designed to slow instinct until it becomes irrelevant. I called my daughter again, knowing it would go to voicemail, needing it to anyway. I spoke slowly, deliberately, as if the steadiness of my voice might carry through the network and reach her wherever she was. I said my granddaughter's name. I said I couldn't reach anyone at the house. I said something had been asked that couldn't wait. Then I hung up before emotion could fracture what needed to stay intact. I pulled up the custody agreement on my computer, a document I hadn't opened in months. Weekends, approved residences, emergency clauses written in language that looked strong until you tried to use them. Everything was technically being followed. That was the problem. Nothing illegal had happened yet. Not on paper. I called the non-emergency police line in the county where the house was located. I explained who I was, my relationship, what had been said, what had happened to the call. I avoided speculation. I stuck to facts. The operator listened politely, the way people do when they are trained to sound engaged without committing to urgency. She told me a wellness check could be requested by a legal guardian. I was not one. I asked what happened if a child disclosed something concerning and communication was cut immediately after. There was a pause, then a careful answer. If the parent requested it. If there was corroboration. If there was imminent danger that could be articulated clearly enough to justify intervention. Articulated clearly enough. As if clarity existed in moments like this. I hung up and called the hospital operator where my daughter worked. I asked to be connected to her department. They transferred me twice before someone finally located her. When she came on the line, her voice was already tight, already braced. She had listened to my messages between patients. She had felt the same drop in her stomach I had felt an hour earlier. I told her exactly what our daughter had asked. I didn't soften it. I didn't protect her from the words. There was a silence on the line so complete I wondered if the call had dropped again. Then she started asking questions, fast and precise, the way she did when a case turned critical. When? Where? Who else was present? Had anything like this been said before? Within minutes, confusion gave way to fear. Fear gave way to action. She contacted her supervisor and left the hospital early. She called the local police herself as the custodial parent. She requested an immediate welfare check. She invoked language that carried weight. Possible exploitation. Sudden communication cut off. Child disclosure. The words moved faster when spoken by the right person. Still, procedure lagged behind urgency. A patrol car was dispatched, but not immediately. The house was in a jurisdiction known for quiet calls, not crises. The estimated arrival time felt obscene. I asked my daughter what she wanted me to do. She told me to stay where I was, to wait for updates, to let the system work. I told her I couldn't. There are moments when obedience feels like betrayal. This was one of them. I grabbed a bag without really packing it. Threw in clothes I didn't remember choosing. I took my documents, my charger, my notebook with the times and notes already written inside. I locked the house out of habit more than necessity. The engine started on the first turn, the sound grounding me in a way nothing else could. As I pulled onto the highway, my daughter called back. She asked where I was. I told her the truth. She didn't argue. She didn't tell me to turn around. She only said to be careful and to keep my phone charged. The drive began as a series of decisions that didn't feel like decisions at all. Exit ramps passed without thought. Gas stops became mechanical. I drank coffee I couldn't taste. Listened to weather alerts I didn't register. My mind stayed fixed on the same image. Her face lowering toward the screen, her voice dropping, the care she had taken with the question. Halfway through the first night, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. An officer identifying himself calmly, professionally. They had arrived at the house. No answer at the door. Gates secured. Lights off. They were attempting contact through registered numbers. I asked about my granddaughter. He said he couldn't confirm her location yet. I kept driving. Every mile put me farther from compliance and closer to consequence, but that calculation no longer mattered. The law had done what it always does in moments like this. It had placed distance between harm and response and called it order. Somewhere near the state line, my daughter called again. Her voice had changed. It was steadier now, flattened by adrenaline and focus. She told me they had located my granddaughter. She was alone in the house, physically unharmed, quiet, not crying. I pulled onto the shoulder and sat there with my hands on the wheel, breathing carefully. Relief came first, sharp and almost painful. Then the questions flooded in. Where was her mother? Where was the grandmother? The answer came slower. The grandmother was still on the property. In the basement. Unresponsive. The words didn't land all at once. They arrived in pieces like debris after an explosion. Basement. Unresponsive. EMS en route. Scene being secured. I asked what that meant. My daughter said they didn't know yet. She told me to keep driving but to be prepared for delays. Investigations. Interviews. Statements. I merged back onto the road with a new understanding settling over me. The system hadn't failed because it was broken. It had worked exactly as designed, slowly, carefully, favoring structure over instinct. And if my granddaughter hadn't asked that question when she did, if the call hadn't ended when it did, the design would have protected the wrong person for much longer. By the time the sun rose, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This was no longer a family emergency. It was the beginning of a record. The road stopped feeling like a place somewhere in northern Georgia. From that point on, it was just motion. Gas stations appeared and disappeared without names. I remember the smell of burnt coffee, the hum of fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning, the way my reflection in the restroom mirror looked unfamiliar, older somehow, stripped down to function. I slept in fragments, 15 minutes at a time with the seat reclined, phone pressed against my chest like a vital organ. Every time it vibrated, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. There were calls from my daughter, calls from numbers I didn't recognize, calls that went unanswered because I was driving and afraid to miss the next one. Time began to lose its edges. Somewhere south of Atlanta, during a stretch of highway bordered by trees dense enough to swallow sound, my phone rang again. This time it was a detective. He spoke carefully, as if every word had been weighed before it left his mouth. My granddaughter had been found alone when officers entered the house. Sitting on the floor of her bedroom, fully dressed, holding a backpack she hadn't packed herself. No food in the kitchen that suggested recent use. No lights on. No note. The house itself had been staged into normalcy. Clean counters. Made beds. Family photos in frames that smiled without knowing why. The grandmother had been located in the basement. The way he said it told me the rest before he did. Basements are places people choose when they don't want to be seen. When they want control. When they want storage instead of sunlight. She was deceased. The cause wasn't immediately clear, but the circumstances were. What investigators discovered down there turned a family visit into a crime scene so complex it required people who specialized in things no family should ever have to name. What had been done wasn't sudden. It hadn't happened in a moment of madness or impulse. It had been staged, repeated, documented. The basement wasn't just a location, it was a system. I pulled off the road again, this time without even realizing I'd done it. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on them. The detective continued speaking, explaining what they could and could not say yet, explaining next steps, explaining protections now in place for my granddaughter. I listened, but my mind kept circling one thought with sickening clarity. This had been happening while people called the house safe. The violation wasn't only physical. It was temporal. It stole time that could never be returned. It rewrote memories. It corrupted trust retroactively, turning every smile and holiday and reassurance into something suspect. I asked how long. He didn't answer directly. He said they were still determining scope. That word, scope, settled into me like lead. Scope meant breadth, duration, others. When I finally reached Jacksonville, the sun was already setting again. 50 hours on the road had erased any sense of arrival. I was directed not to the house, but to a temporary family services facility where my granddaughter was being kept away from cameras, questions, and anyone whose presence hadn't been cleared. She didn't run to me when she saw me. That was the first thing I noticed. She stood still, watching me carefully, as if checking whether I was real. When I knelt in front of her, she didn't cry. She simply leaned forward and rested her forehead against my shoulder, her weight trusting but measured. I didn't ask questions. I didn't promise things I couldn't guarantee. I told her she was safe. I told her she had done nothing wrong. I told her I believed her, even though she hadn't said anything yet. Her body responded before her words ever would. Later, alone in a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee, I was shown photographs I wish I could unsee. Not of her, but of the environment. The setup. The care taken to hide, to catalog, to preserve. The violation wasn't chaotic. It was organized. That realization hollowed something out of me. Chaos can be blamed on loss of control. Organization implies intention, planning, patience. This wasn't an accident of circumstance. It was a choice made over and over again. When I finally slept that night, it wasn't rest. It was shut down. And when I woke, I understood that whatever grief I thought I was carrying was only the outer layer. The deeper damage, the kind that required years and systems and international coordination, had only just been uncovered. And it had been uncovered because a child had trusted me enough to ask a question she didn't fully understand. That knowledge would stay with me longer than any image, any document, any courtroom. Because it meant the truth had not wanted to stay buried. The first crack didn't come from outrage or confession. Came from detail. That surprised me. I had expected the truth to arrive with force, with raised voices, dramatic revelations, some moment sharp enough to mark before and after. Instead, it seeped in through margins and timestamps, through the quiet certainty of people who had seen patterns like this before and knew better than to dramatize them. The detective assigned to the case met me in a small, windowless room 2 days after my arrival. He didn't introduce himself with rank or accomplishment. Just a name and a chair pulled back at a respectful distance. He spoke like someone who understood that anger wasn't useful yet, and grief needed space before it hardened into something unmanageable. He didn't start with my granddaughter. He started with devices. There had been more than one. Hidden but not well enough. Old phones kept just in case. External drives labeled with benign names. Cloud accounts accessed through shared family credentials no one thought to change. The kind of digital clutter that accumulates when someone believes longevity equals invisibility. What broke the illusion wasn't force. It wasn't even discovery in the dramatic sense. It was correlation. Digital timestamps that didn't line up with family stories. Files created during hours when the house was supposedly empty. Metadata that contradicted alibis that had once sounded airtight when spoken aloud. Payment logs disguised as hobby expenses, camera equipment, storage subscriptions, software licenses. Spread thin enough to pass casual review, but unmistakable when viewed together. The detective slid a folder across the table and opened it just enough for me to see the structure, not the content. He didn't ask if I wanted to look. He already knew the answer. These materials, he said, point beyond one person, beyond one house. I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't interrupt. He explained how the files were categorized. Not chaotically, not emotionally, methodically, as if the act itself had been turned into a project, measured, improved, refined over time. The kind of organization that suggested learning curves and shared standards. There were signs of exchange, trade, distribution pathways that followed familiar routes investigators had seen before, only this time originating from someone no one would have suspected. A grandmother, a trusted caretaker, a woman whose social circle vouched for her with reflexive certainty. She wasn't acting alone, he said quietly. And she wasn't improvising. That sentence landed differently than all the others. Alone implies isolation. Improvising implies desperation. This was neither. I asked how they knew. He pointed to schedules. Not calendars on the wall, but notes embedded in files. Time blocks that coincided with visits. Adjustments made when routines changed. Escalation plans written in language that stripped the acts of humanity and reduced them to process. It was there, in those notes, that the narrative first fractured beyond repair. The grandmother hadn't just recorded what she did. She had documented outcomes, reactions, compliance thresholds, behavioral shifts. She had written about trust as if it were a variable that could be measured and optimized. There were references to what worked, what didn't, what needed to be adjusted next time. I sat very still while he spoke. There are moments when moving feels like permission for reality to continue, and I wasn't ready for that yet. My granddaughter's question came back to me with new clarity. She hadn't been asking out of confusion. She had been checking whether something she sensed was wrong actually was. The detective said something then that I will never forget. He said children don't usually disclose like that unless they believe someone will listen. Not because they are brave, but because they are exhausted. She did the only thing she could, he said. She asked. That question, asked quietly, carefully, without accusation, had done what years of adult oversight had failed to do. It had introduced unpredictability into a system that relied on routine and silence. It had triggered exposure without her ever knowing the weight of what she was disrupting. In the days that followed, more allies emerged. People whose roles were technical, not emotional. Analysts, digital forensic specialists, prosecutors who spoke in conditional language and footnotes, but whose resolve showed in the hours they kept. The case expanded outward, not with spectacle but with inevitability. Each file pointed to another. Each transaction referenced a network already known, already partially mapped. This wasn't discovery from scratch, it was connection. The grandmother's careful documentation became the thing that dismantled everything she had built. Her need for control, for order, for preservation had created a record too complete to deny. When I asked why she had kept so much, the detective answered without hesitation. People who believe they're untouchable don't fear evidence, he said. They believe it proves their intelligence. That belief had cost her the secrecy she relied on, and it had cost others far more. I visited my granddaughter every day, though the visits were structured and supervised. I didn't ask her to talk. I didn't ask her to explain. I read to her. I sat near her. I let her decide how close was comfortable. Once, while coloring, she paused and said she was glad I came when I did. I told her I would have come no matter what. That was true. But what I didn't say, what I still struggle to hold, is that she came to me first. And because she did, the narrative everyone else had relied on began to collapse under the quiet weight of its own records. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no press conference, no sudden flood of answers. It came quietly, in the way professionals lower their voices when they move from theory to certainty. The grandmother's death had initially been treated as an endpoint, tragic, contained, almost convenient in the way some people privately allow themselves to think. One perpetrator, one location, one narrative that could be sealed, processed, archived. Families prefer that shape. So do institutions if they're honest. But the documentation refused to stay small. What investigators found wasn't just evidence of harm. It was infrastructure. There were schedules that extended months into the future. Notes that reference changes already implemented and others still pending. Accounts linked not only to distribution but to feedback. The harm had been shared, reviewed, adjusted. The files spoke to each other, creating a conversation that outlived the person who started it. The detective told me the turning point came when they realized the grandmother had kept records of her own escalation. Not diaries, not confessions, operational notes. She had documented thresholds, how long before a child resisted, how routines affected compliance, what environmental changes increased silence. It was written in language stripped of emotion, as if emotion were an inefficiency to be eliminated. Reading it, the analysts didn't see madness. They saw process, and process implies replication. What changed everything was a timestamp. Buried deep in a folder mislabeled as tax records was a file modified after her death. Not accessed, modified. That meant someone else had credentials. Someone else had been watching. Someone else had reacted. From that moment, the case stopped being local. The word network began to appear more frequently in conversations. Then cells. Then jurisdictional overlap. These weren't words meant for families. They belonged to briefing rooms and sealed court documents. But they were shaping my granddaughter's future whether I liked it or not. Federal agencies became involved. Then international ones. Requests went out quietly to partners who specialized in following digital trails that crossed borders without asking permission. The grandmother's careful records, once her shield, became a map. What had been traded wasn't just images. It was access, introductions, vetting, trust built through shared secrecy. The grandmother hadn't been a lone actor operating in the dark. She had been a node. And nodes, once identified, tend to light up everything they're connected to. I learned this secondhand, filtered through language meant to protect me from details I didn't need. Still, the weight of it pressed down on every interaction. When my granddaughter was moved to a new location for safety, no one told me where she was going. When her schedule changed, it wasn't explained. When her therapist was reassigned, I wasn't asked. At first, that loss of control cut deeply. I had spent my life believing that proximity equaled protection, that being present was enough. This process challenged that belief with ruthless efficiency. Protection, I learned, sometimes means stepping back. The strategic shift wasn't just legal. It was personal. I stopped asking for updates I couldn't influence. I focused on what I could anchor: consistency, presence without pressure, predictability. I became the person who showed up at the same time, sat in the same chair, brought the same book. No surprises, no questions she didn't invite. She began to relax in increments so small they were almost invisible. A longer stay in the room. A question about when I would come back. One afternoon, she asked if the bad people were gone. I told her the truth, carefully shaped. I said some had been found. Others were being looked for. And that there were many adults working to make sure she wouldn't have to see them again. She considered that, then nodded once, as if filing it away. Meanwhile, the case grew teeth. Arrests began, not announced, not celebrated. Just removals. People disappearing from professional directories. Accounts going dark. Names surfacing briefly in legal filings before being replaced by initials. The process was deliberate, methodical, and patient. The grandmother's own documentation became the backbone of prosecution. Her need to record everything had created a chain so intact it resisted challenge. Defense strategies collapsed under the weight of her own words, her own timestamps, her own structure. When I asked the detective whether she had known this could happen, he paused. "I think she believed she was smarter than everyone else," he said. "People like that confuse intelligence with immunity." That confusion had consequences far beyond her own life. As the scope expanded, so did the silence from certain corners of the family. People who had once filled rooms with certainty now avoided eye contact. Invitations stopped. Statements softened. No one wanted to examine how close they had been to something they didn't want to name. I didn't push them. I had learned that denial is most powerful when confronted directly. I chose distance instead. The hidden truth was no longer hidden. It was just slow, heavy, and procedural. Justice didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with paperwork, extraditions, sealed warrants, and time. And time, I learned, was no longer the enemy. Time was now doing its work. The system that had once protected the wrong person was being repurposed, step by careful step, to dismantle what she had built. Not because of outrage, but because of records. And because a child had asked a question that disrupted a process designed to depend on her silence. That was the shift. Everything after that was inevitable. There was no confrontation in the way people imagine one. No raised voices. No dramatic admissions. No moment where someone broke down and confessed under pressure. That fantasy belongs to movies and to people who need chaos to feel like resolution. What actually happened was quieter and far more final. It began in courtrooms that didn't smell like justice so much as routine. Fluorescent lights. Neutral carpeting. Screens positioned at precise angles so no one had to look directly at anyone else for too long. The machinery of accountability doesn't rely on spectacle. It relies on sequence. Statements were read calmly. Dates, times, file paths, transactions. Each one presented without commentary, without accusation in the emotional sense. Just facts, arranged so carefully that denial had nowhere to stand. I sat behind my daughter most days, not close enough to touch her shoulder, but close enough to be present. She had learned, as I had, that presence didn't require proximity. It required steadiness. My granddaughter testified remotely. That decision alone marked a reversal that few people in the room fully appreciated. There would be no courtroom gaze, no long walk to a witness stand, no eyes tracking her movement as if her body were part of the evidence. She appeared on a screen instead, seated in a neutral room with a trained advocate just out of frame. She was prepared, protected, precise. She didn't tell a story. She answered questions. Yes. No. I don't know. I don't remember. That didn't happen. That did. There was no hesitation that could be exploited. No emotional display to be misinterpreted. She spoke the way someone speaks when they have been taught that truth doesn't need decoration. I watched the people on the other side of the courtroom more than I watched her. I watched the subtle shifts, the way shoulders tightened, the way pens paused mid-note, the way confidence drained not all at once, but in increments. The narrative they had relied on for years began to collapse under its own records. Defense arguments tried to frame context. Misunderstandings. Isolated actions. But context is fragile when confronted with pattern. And misunderstanding cannot survive time-stamped repetition. The grandmother's documentation was introduced piece by piece, stripped of any chance to be dismissed as aberration. Her own language, clinical, methodical, was read aloud by people who had no stake in softening it. The room absorbed it in silence. Names followed. Not shouted. Not announced. Just entered into record. Individuals connected through transactions, shared platforms, overlapping schedules. People who had believed themselves insulated by distance or anonymity were suddenly present through their own data. Some were arrested before the trial concluded. Others disappeared into legal processes that would take years to resolve. Their absence was noted only by empty chairs and sealed files. There was no moment when everyone realized at once that it was over. There were several moments when it became impossible to argue that it wasn't. When the verdicts came, they were delivered without flourish. The judge's voice didn't rise. Sentences were handed down in language that focused on duration, conditions, restrictions. The words life and forever never appeared. Justice doesn't speak that way. What mattered was removal. Access revoked. Networks dismantled. Channels closed. The machinery that had once facilitated harm was now being used to prevent it. I didn't feel relief the way I expected to. What I felt was something closer to gravity returning. Like a pressure that had been artificially suspended was allowed to settle where it belonged. After one of the final hearings, my granddaughter asked if she had done okay. I told her she had done exactly what she needed to do. She nodded, satisfied, then asked if we could go somewhere quiet afterward. Somewhere with trees. Somewhere that didn't feel like a building where people talked about her without seeing her. We did. We walked slowly, saying very little. She pointed out things she liked. A bird. A broken branch shaped like a question mark. Ordinary details reclaiming their place. I realized then that the true reversal wasn't legal. It was narrative. For years, adults had constructed a story that required her silence to survive. That story had positioned her as passive, unaware, manageable. With one question and later with quiet, careful truth, she had dismantled it. Not through defiance, through clarity. As we sat on a bench and watched the light change through the trees, I understood something else too. There would be no return to before. There shouldn't be. Justice hadn't restored innocence. It had removed the lie that innocence was required to deserve protection. Years passed without ceremony. No marker announced when the hardest part ended or when healing officially began. It arrived the way most real things do, unevenly, quietly, sometimes without permission. My daughter moved closer within the year. Not out of fear, not out of retreat, but out of recalibration. She needed fewer miles between her child and the people who showed up without conditions. She found work that allowed for daylight dinners and weekends that didn't disappear into exhaustion. I watched her relearn parts of herself that had been paused for survival. My granddaughter changed in ways that resisted summary. Some days she seemed older than her age, observant and careful with her trust. Other days she was unmistakably a child again, laughing too loudly, asking questions that wandered, forgetting where she left her shoes. Those moments mattered more than any therapeutic milestone. They meant space had been reclaimed. We built routines that didn't revolve around protection but around life. Morning walks, quiet breakfasts, homework done at the same table every afternoon. Predictability without vigilance. Safety without spectacle. She didn't talk about what happened unless she wanted to. When she did, it was without drama. Facts presented, then released. Her therapist said this was a sign of integration, not avoidance. I believed them, but I trusted her more. What stayed with me wasn't the drive or the investigations or the sentences handed down in rooms that never quite felt real. Those things belonged to systems. Necessary systems. But still systems. What stayed with me was that moment on the screen. The way she lowered her voice. The care she took with the question. The trust implicit in choosing me as the place where uncertainty could land. I had spent years believing my role as a grandfather was defined by presence alone. Show up when invited. Stay within bounds. Respect distance. That night taught me something different. Listening is not passive. Belief is not neutral. Response is a form of love. I sometimes think about how easily that call could have ended differently. A dropped signal 30 seconds earlier. A distraction on my end. A response that dismissed instead of received. The margin between exposure and continuation was thin enough to disappear without notice. That knowledge doesn't haunt me. Clarifies me. I am slower now. More deliberate. I watch for the small shifts in tone, the questions asked sideways, the moments when someone checks whether they're allowed to say what they're thinking. I don't rush to fill silence anymore. Silence is often where truth gathers courage. My granddaughter knows she can come to me with anything, not because I promise solutions but because I promise presence. Because I proved once that I would come, that I would believe her, that I would not wait for permission when urgency demanded movement. That understanding has become the quiet center of our lives. Justice didn't fix everything. It never does. but it removed the lie that harm must be hidden to be endured. It replaced secrecy with record. It replaced isolation with witness. And in the end, that was enough to let something better grow. When she asked that question, she didn't know what she was starting. She didn't need to. All she needed was someone to hear her. I did. I believed her. I came. And that, more than any verdict, any sentence, any closed network, is what mattered.